Once the Supreme Court issues a decision, this case acts as a precedent or guidance for all future cases. Along those lines, so the documents accompanying the decision become potentially more important than the decision itself. There are up to 3 types of documents associated with each decision: the majority opinion, the dissenting opinion, and concurring opinions. The majority opinion is the legal rationale of the majority of the court. Basically, it answers why the majority ruled the way they did, and how this case can be applied for future cases. Once the majority opinion is drafted, it often becomes the focus of prolonged internal bargaining as the writer attempts to persuade the other justices that its legal arguments are correct. But generally, to persuade colleagues to maintain or shift their positions, the drafter must change the opinion's language and perhaps blur its message, allowing each member of the majority to find language in the opinion that he or she can agree with. As you can imagine, it's a complex process with significant negotiation to make sure that people stay on board with the decision of the court. If someone disagrees with the majority of the court, then he or she will write a dissenting opinion. This is the explanation of why the person disagrees with the majority of the court, and why he or she ruled against the majority. This document can be important in defining the scope of the decision, or in some cases can be the basis for reversing the case in the future. Finally, we can potentially also have a concurring opinion. This is when someone who voted with the majority agrees with the decision of the majority, but votes yes or no for a different reason than the majority did, and wants to explain why. This isn't necessarily a part of every court case, but it is part of at least some, and can be important because it, again, limits the scope of the case and provides an alternative legal rationale for someone's vote, providing guidance to lower courts and future plaintiffs. One final thought on this topic before moving on. There is no way to appeal a decision of the Supreme Court. Once they make a decision, they have the last word on much of public policy. Things like the death penalty, the abortion, healthcare, any number of other controversial issues have been decided by the Supreme Court. Think about this for a minute. 9 people who were never elected and have no accountability to the people decide the fate of some of our most controversial laws and policies. However, the courts have no enforcement mechanism and face formidable obstacles when their policy preferences differ sharply from those of Congress or the President. An interesting note, there's actually research out there that shows that the Supreme Court budget correlates with how many laws they repeal. The more they go against Congress, the lower their budget. So even informally, there's mechanisms that get used to punish the Supreme Court for being a little too activist. So how do you become a Supreme Court justice? Excellent question again. Let me tell you. First, it's important to note that there are no statutory requirements in the Constitution for justices of the Supreme Court. That is to say, there's no age requirement or citizenship requirements like there are for other branches of government, nor is there even any requirement that you have any legal experience or education. You don't have to be a lawyer or a judge or anything like that. Anyone can be on the Supreme Court if you're nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Anyone listening to this lecture could become a Supreme Court justice, and even people who don't listen to this lecture could become Supreme Court justices someday. The only requirement, again, is that you're nominated by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate as described in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. The Senate, as a rule, typically confirms presidential nominees to the court, although we've seen that change recently with President Obama's last nomination of Merrick Garland. But there are basically 2 ways that someone can be rejected for membership on the Supreme Court. The first is political views. Things like political extremism and having controversial opinions can be a good reason to reject somebody. The second is experience. The public will usually unite behind rejection, and the Senate will not confirm people who don't appear to have the relevant experience. So in a way, the system works, and we typically don't get unqualified people on the Supreme Court. We may not get the most qualified, but at least we avoid the most unqualified. That's all I have for this lecture. Thanks for listening, everybody, and get ready for our next set of lectures where we finally talk about civil rights, civil liberties, learn about a bunch of Supreme Court cases following up on this lecture. So thanks, everybody, and I'm looking forward to what should be another big day coming soon.